to increase justice because they're a way of balancing out information inequalities. So organizations which are already powerful attempt to increase their power through a knowledge advantage, sucking up as much information as possible for themselves, keeping it from others to increase their knowledge advantage. But we can do that as well. Individuals can do that as well. Try to hold on to their knowledge, keep it to themselves, or the other thing is to share it to the public. So then everyone gets it, an even experience. But keep it from these very powerful organizations. So transparency and privacy are two ways of creating justice. But when you see large organizations attempting to grab on to privacy, what they're actually doing is grabbing on to secrecy, and that's something else. Well, secrecy is a way to, it's just a very simple description to talk about hiding information, and it can be legitimate sometimes. Wrong. If they start to go wrong in secret, then the result can be calamitous. So that's why they need to be transparent, because they are so powerful. And when they go bad, those actions can affect a lot of people. I think it's really quite a simple analysis. And then if you think about, well, you get this thing about, well, who's responsible, which groups should be responsible for keeping secrets, or where the line is drawn, or all that stuff. Well, I think that's fairly easy as well. For WikiLeaks, we are a publisher. We specialize in publishing things that are very hard to publish. And we specialize in getting hold of things that are very hard to get hold of. And that's our primary function. And that's our place in international society, is to do that to the best of our ability. That's our function. Now, if the military or intelligence services or police are engaged in legitimate action, and many of their actions are illegitimate, if they're engaged in a legitimate thing, such as the Mexican state legitimately trying to protect the sovereignty of Mexico, say from predation by the United States, or to investigate drug cartels, and it needs some secrecy to do that, that's fine. Sometimes it does need secrecy to do that. But it's its responsibility to perform that secrecy. Like, it's our responsibility to publish, and it's journalists' responsibility to publish and inform the public and undo secrecy. Sometimes policing organizations in limited areas have a necessity for secrecy for their operations. Just like we keep our sources secret, we have a necessity for secrecy. But it's not the police, it's not the responsibility of the police to keep our sources secret. It's not our responsibility to protect intelligence agencies or protect police. If they act in an incompetent way, they act in an incompetent way. And the good thing is that often we can all benefit from that. Yes. Well, there's a grand shift happening in the world, and that's, I suppose, this film is a human story. The great background all around it is this incredible shift that's happened in the world over the past 20 years. It's actually not something that's happened just in the past few years, although it's rapidly accelerating. It's happened over a course of 20 years. It's an exponential process, and like many exponentials, you don't really feel them in the early phase of the exponential, but later on, you really start to feel it. Just like other forms of these processes are the population explosion of wild rabbits or yogurt. It seems like the yogurt is just like milk if you're making yogurt, and very, very rapidly it starts becoming thick and it's yogurt. So this is what is happening with mass surveillance and its integration into our society. And this is an event that is affecting all of global civilization all at once. It's a very destabilizing event. And there's only two things which are equivalent to it that have affected all global civilization all at once, and which seem to be not quite in our control. And that was the invention of atomic weapons, which pushed the world towards the state of Armageddon. It could have wiped out at least all the civilizations in the northern hemispheres and much of the economic fate of the world, reduced nearly everyone to starvation and death. And that's a problem that we suffered with, and many people sought to understand during the Cold War and to lobby for peace in different ways and to change the balance of how the superpowers interrelated with each other to reduce the chance of a nuclear war developing. And the other one is climate change. And climate change is one of these problems that is systemic. It's affecting all the world at once. We don't seem to really quite be in control of it. We sort of understand it now, and we understand what processes are going, but we can't seem to get our political institutions together to do anything about it in time. And mass surveillance is another one of these systems. Where it differs is that it's not something that happens outside of us, like nuclear weapons or like global warming, that we can sort of sit back and talk about and look at and discuss and theorize about how to deal with the problem. It's something that happens inside us and between us to sort of all people simultaneously. The United States has annexed tens of thousands of computer systems directly, gone into them in Mexico, taken control over key elements of Mexican infrastructure. And of course, nearly all of Mexico's communications with the rest of the world is intercepted by the United States. That's true for most other countries. So that's something that affects how we speak to each other and how we consider the world, and how even we consider this very problem. So it's a problem that feeds on itself. And it's one of the things that you'll understand after you see this film is that a certain paranoia develops in response to knowing the truth about this issue. And that paranoia can be paralyzing. So even talking about this issue can make the problem worse if we're not careful, because people become concerned that, well, if they're speaking about the National Security Agency or the United States in particular ways, and even the Mexican government itself is engaged in more surveillance, then perhaps that will cause problems for those very people speaking about it. So it could be a runaway process in that people who are surveilled don't like to speak to each other about these problems. And the result is they don't speak to each other about these problems as much, or other problems with the government. And so the problem gets worse faster. It's getting worse faster anyway, because computer technology is developing on an exponential curve. So doubling in speed every 2 years, the amount that can be intercepted and understood, doubling every 2 years. So it's a very delicate situation. There are some things that are working in the opposite direction, namely that we can communicate with each other faster, we can come up with ideas faster, we can collaborate faster. This churning process, this interweaving of ideas and political systems and trade makes a complex, rapidly moving system, which even if you intercept it all, is harder to understand and act on before it's moved on. And it's not at all clear which one of these forces are dominating. So that said, the rise of the left-wing governments in Latin America and the recent victory of a left-wing government in Greece and the pending victory, probably, of Podemos in Spain, all things that the United States certainly doesn't want, despite all this mass surveillance, may suggest that at least in the short term, the factor that is coupled to the speed of interaction is dominant. I think that's something to be optimistic about, but it's not at all clear or predictable that that we won't end up in a totalitarian society with mass surveillance everywhere. Not in the classic Soviet model, but of course in a new model, because we are in a new age, in a sort of a weird postmodern high-tech conformism that comes about from everyone having one identity that goes through life, which is coupled to the various computer systems. They can't avoid coupled to their passports, and therefore every major international power grouping in the world, because all this stuff is shared between states. But that's a really strong difference in the relationship between individuals and states that has ever existed before. So in some ways, we're the last free generation. The next generation that has been born enters into a relationship, an information relationship with the state, with its identity cards, with its information trails, and that is spread all over the world. So it's quite a disparity in the type of power that the relationship has. One individual related to all the major power factions in the world almost as soon as they're born, as soon as they have their first identity documents, at least. And these things are shared around in intelligence agencies and passport control and credit cards, etc. And what does that mean? That means we're all entering into a system of relations with major power structures, states, if you want to call them that, but they become more complex than this classical notion of the state, that we can't escape from. There's no place outside this system anymore for the next generation. So that means we are part of the one global interstate system, whether we like it or not. And therefore, we have to manage that thing. We have to take control of that thing. There's no place outside it. Yeah. Private intermediaries, corporations like Google, Facebook, Amazon, have a new business model. And that business model, although Amazon is mixed, but with Facebook and Google, it's pure, which is it profits from gaining as much private information about people as possible to make them predictable. That's what it does. Google, for example, in nearly every area of life, from maps to what videos you watch to ads on third-party websites you don't even know a couple to Google, collects all this information about you. Android phones, which are now more than 80% of the phones in the market, Google is tracking more than a million of these turned on for the first time each day, tracking where they are, exactly where they are, what Wi-Fi networks around them, what people search for, their contacts list, etc. So it's a toss-up whether Google knows more about you than the NSA without Google. But Google is in the United States. Its management structure has a revolving door with the State Department. It's worked with the intelligence services to do things, joint projects like the Google satellites, Google GeoEye-1. It's made equipment for the National Security Agency. And then, as you'll see in the Snowden revelations, well, it collects all that in the United States, developing sophisticated profiles of every human being on Earth. And then, of course, the NSA and other US-based intelligence agencies or law enforcement agencies or other major US power structures, then just stick their fangs into that. So even if Google politically was as pure as snow, and it's not at all, even if it was, the fact is it is in the same business that the National Security Agency is in, the US intelligence agencies are in, collecting much information as possible, about as many people as possible, storing it, indexing it, building profiles of people, and to predict their behavior. And then, of course, the National Security Agency just comes along and sticks its fangs into this vast reservoir that Google and Facebook are building up. And there's been some recent publicity about that in relation to us, actually. We just found out that Google had not only gone after WikiLeaks proper, but it had gone after the accounts of 3 of our most senior journalists and handed all their emails and other data, search terms, etc., off to the US government, and had been gagged about it. In fact, there is still, came out today, Google said there are still active gags on Google by the US government about what it can say insofar as how it's cooperating with the United States about WikiLeaks. There's a personal example that personally affects us, but actually it's happening to everyone because through the PRISM system, the United States government is able to search all these Google emails. It's a repository of material that is being built up and collected, search terms, etc. And in some ways, it's completely expected. What happens when you create a global market? When you connect up the world with the information flow covering the world with a transportable good, which doesn't expire, information takes 220 milliseconds to get from New York to Nairobi. It doesn't expire. So therefore, you've got one global market. Well, of course, you get one big player in that market. That's what happens to markets. If the goods don't decay by transport, then you end up with a big central player. And if you don't have an antitrust regulator to prevent monopolies forming, the monopolies form. And Google is now a global monopoly in many languages. So is Facebook. And we can expect to see that pattern continue. It's now trying to vertically integrate all over the place with wiring up towns and making satellite internet and so on, completely integrating people into its fold. But its fold is also the same fold as the dominant constellation of power groups within the United States. So it's not as, you shouldn't look at it as a separate entity. It's a coupled together in a legal way, in that Google can be is coerced to make its information searchable. But they're also coupled together at a social level in the senior management. Yes, it's a book on Google that I wrote, which is out. I'm just trying to think if the Spanish edition has come out. I believe it has. Yeah, the Spanish edition has come out, and that's When Google Met WikiLeaks. So you can have a look at that. It's quite, I found that very interesting to research, and I was surprised actually. I thought I knew what was going on with Google, but actually it was much more interesting, its relationship with the United States government and its ideological view of the world. Well, it's a big battle. You know, we have banking blockade, like the US made against Cuba was made against us, with Visa, MasterCard, PayPal, Bank of America, Western Union, Diners Club, Discover, all involved in blockading people getting money to us. Even Yoko Ono, we won some prize in New York, some prize for courage. And Yoko Ono went to transfer it to us, and the Bank of America blocked it. So we started a political party in Australia, and the Bank of America blocked donations from the United States coming to that. So then we have the various legal cases, and we have about a dozen now. Now, more than half of those we have initiated. They're sort of attacks in the criminal law and civil law. We sued the banks and so on. That's going pretty well, actually, reasonably well. Then the US case still continues. It's the largest ever investigation against the publisher. It's still going. Quite a lot of effort goes into that. And then we can talk about our work proper. So a lot of effort has gone into, I suppose, making our work scalable. So making our own Google, if you like, internally, which is pretty cool. If you look at search.wikileaks.org, and you can search more than 8.3 million leaked documents at once, in a tenth of a second, and devising ways of doing that for massive leaks of emails and PDFs and other things. A lot of research and development has gone into that, and that means we can roll out these mega leaks over the course of this year. And I don't like to think about them so much as leaks, actually, because that sort of comes from the position of being a news person. And while, I've done investigative journalism for a long time, but actually I find news kind of boring and ephemeral. I like history, right? We all rest upon this, the knowledge of our civilization, the knowledge of our nation, even if it was what happened just last week. That's the framework in which we live in as human beings. There's nothing else we can do. We can't pull anything out of the sand that didn't already exist or recombine air. We've got to have something to work with. And so the process of getting that information out of secretive institutions like the State Department or Pentagon or CIA or NSA, as you see in this movie, is so important because it reveals how the powerful institutions in human society actually work, and how on earth can we manage human society or our own affairs if we don't understand how the place we live in actually works. It's impossible. We can't rise above previous generations unless we have better knowledge than the previous generations about how human civilization actually works. And I've been saying for some years that actually, well, you can learn a lot from different political theoreticians and philosophers, but basically they're all bankrupt. And they're bankrupt because the theory that is produced by them can only be as good as the information that was fed in. And if you don't understand how human institutions actually behave in the modern era, then how can you produce a prescriptive political theory or how they should behave if you don't know how they actually do behave? It's a fantasy. So we have to start understanding how these new postmodern powerful organizations that cross the classic state-private sector divide. The National Security Agency, for example, 80% run by private corporations. Edward Snowden did not work for the NSA. People think that he did. He didn't work for the NSA directly. He worked for a contractor, Booz Allen Hamilton. And that's not a surprise, because most of what the NSA does is run by these big private corporations. That's the nature of modern states. Even the hard power elements are run by private corporations. And so they've become very fluid in how they deal with structures and people sloshing around them. And that's not something that really existed for classical political theoreticians. We live in a different age, and so we need a different political analysis. To have a different political analysis, we have to have the information about what our age actually is. You don't want the ending, right? Well, I mean, the movie kind of documents itself in a way, but if I try and put it into context, some of the things that aren't in the movie, comes into a movement, a bigger movement that has been going for more than 20 years. Actually, even longer than that. So you can go back to the Church Committee in 1975, and this was a committee to investigate all these abuses that were being conducted by the NSA. And an article published in Ramparts magazine in 1973 by a whistleblower, Perry Fellock. It's on WikiLeaks. You can, if you search WikiLeaks for Ramparts, you should find that article. So there have actually been cycles of exposing the NSA, but there being kind of reformist movements in the 70s to re-regulate it, to stop its abuses, and then they're kind of forgotten about. And I, in 1999, published an investigation into an aspect of the NSA, but a number of authors also had. And that built up to the internet age. And what was different in the internet age is that everyone became interceptable en masse. So before, yes, the National Security Agency was intercepting many of the international faxes, for example, nearly all the telexes that were sent internationally, and key voice calls. But about 1999, they worked out how to do automatic voice transcription, voice recognition. And not completely accurate, but accurate enough to search it, and then gradually started deploying that. But then we made it all much easier for them by getting off the telephone and starting to get onto email and SMSs, and producing great repositories about ourselves. Yeah, and so the NSA really prospered as a result. And there were movements under Bush and some exposures that revealed different parts of mass interception apparatus. And those people following it really closely, like me, because I needed to protect WikiLeaks. Well, we knew all this stuff was going on. In fact, I wrote a book the year before, Cypherpunks, and I sort of give this impending doom speech about mass surveillance in that. But people didn't really pay attention. And the great thing that Edward Snowden did was not only that he brought out documents, simple, clear, fresh documents that people could take note of, but he triggered a reaction by the US government. And that reaction endorsed the disclosures. So the White House, through its overreaction, and you'll see some parts of that where Evo Morales' jet is, actually you don't see that in the film, but you may remember that Evo Morales' jet was forced to land in Austria, and the White House made all sorts of crazy statements, and we were part of this struggle, led this struggle to get Edward Snowden out of Hong Kong into safety in Russia in response. That drew everyone's attention to what was going on, because the White House was taking it very seriously. The intelligence agencies were taking it very seriously. They were pressuring other states. They were throwing out extradition orders. They were using their diplomatic intelligence and law enforcement muscle. And so as a result, people went, okay, so that's a signifier that this stuff is really important, that somehow this is, they feel that this is coupled in a really important way to their power. And it is, don't forget that. You will see all these statements about, oh, it's about catching terrorists. That's not true. That's always been a secondary use of mass surveillance. It was around long before terrorists were considered a big issue. Inside, it's always been called strategic surveillance, where you intercept everything, because it's like this strategic manufacture of tanks, or like atomic weapons are strategic. They affect the relationships between whole continents, or a superpower in many different states. And what gives a superpower its advantage. So the deep state, that central power element of the United States, was rattled. And why was it rattled? Because it thought it might lose the thing that gave it such power, that knowledge advantage versus the rest of the world. And you'll see that the tensions in the film ultimately actually arise out of that, and that alone. The knowledge advantage the deep state had in the United States was threatened. Now, something has happened since, a rather horrible thing, which is the Western intelligence agencies, principally National Security Agency and GCHQ here in the United Kingdom, discovered that it didn't matter if the public found out. So they thought they would lose all these powers. They thought, you know, they would be seriously compromised in their ability to mass intercept people. They're extremely surprised that didn't happen, and the push that happened in '75 with the Church Committee didn't happen this time around, and that they got away with it, at least at the political level. Technically, there's lots of programmers and so on producing encryption programs that may be quite interesting. Encryption's being put into, you know, many more different applications. Even WhatsApp has some kind of encryption now. That may cause them some problems, but at the political level, they've gotten away with it. And that has made them extremely bold. And here in the United Kingdom, for example, they're making all sorts of ambit power grabs to demand to legalize everything that they've been doing and even advance it further. Because they felt before this information was so public that if it became public, there'd be a problem. So they tried to be a bit careful. Now that it has become public and they've gotten away with it politically, they feel, well, we don't even need to be private about this sort of thing anymore. And just the day before yesterday, for example, the British military announced publicly the construction of a unit of 1,500 soldiers to put propaganda onto Facebook and Twitter. 1,500 strong social media propaganda unit, conducting what they call the dark arts of strategic communications. And said this publicly. I think this is not something that could have been imagined in the 1980s. They feel that, you know, they've seen that actually they can get away with this kind of thing. And so why not have the efficiencies of openness, the speed of openness, instead of having to try and keep things secret, and just do it nakedly. And that's a sort of unusual, fluid, postmodern neo-state that we're entering into, where the sort of fluid relationship between states and other states and private organizations and culture and information flow means that you can violate these classical notions about the relationship between a state and a populace. We don't have a state and a populace anymore. That's gone. We have some much more interesting fluid glue intermingling these two groups. I should give you an update. Since the film was put to bed, so it's been nominated now for an Oscar, which is great. Edward Snowden got asylum in Russia. The asylum has been successfully renewed, so he's fine and safe in that country. He can even travel now. He has travel papers. He has to be very careful about traveling because the US, of course, is still after him, and they want to get their man. Yeah, so that's, and the political attempts at political reform in the United States, there was the big fuss about it. They have failed, conclusively failed, and even as in the UK, it's gotten worse. The intermediaries have been a bit embarrassed, Google and so on, and they're trying to look like they're protecting their users more and encrypting more stuff and so on, which is good, but ultimately, in the case of Google and Facebook, while they may encrypt the communications that go between you and them, they still collect all the information in the United States, where the National Security Agency just sticks its fangs in and sucks it out. So it's more for PR than for anything practical. But other technological companies are, feel for market competitiveness that they must introduce these new encryption systems. And these new encryption systems, if they're done right, can work. It's very hard to determine if they're done right, on the other hand. And so they're easily compromised socially or technically, because it's very hard to work out if they've been done right. Go. I certainly can. Thanks. Yeah, so starting with your last question first, I have been thinking about this, and often such information comes out to the public, and you have situations, as I described with the Edward Snowden revelation, where within the United States, I think it's made the problem even worse, because they realize now that they can get away with it even if it's in public. And so they've become even more brazen. And that's definitely true in the UK. It's even clearer in the UK. However, while you might not get the political reform that you want on a particular issue, it is a driver elsewhere. So the Snowden materials are a driver for technological change. They're a driver for changes of behavior of other state institutions, and a driver for the change of behavior in other major organizations, say like Petrobras in Brazil, which has been was fired upon, and presumably Mexican counterintelligence as well, to change their behavior. The organized bodies responding to information, not at the electoral democratic level, not even at the popular democratic level, but at the organizational level, including that of other states. And finally, when a government doesn't respond, doesn't change its behavior, it seems to act with impunity in response to something that is revealed, that starts to erode its moral authority as time goes by. And this gradual erosion can lead to something else. And I think that is what has resulted in what has happened in Greece, for example, and Spain, is the erosion of the authority of the governments in those countries. And so as a result of that erosion, a new player comes into being, which has not yet had its authority or integrity eroded in that process, and it is able to seize political momentum. So I think we shouldn't be too grim when we see impunity from the government in response to information being revealed. We must make sure that everyone remembers what has been revealed, and because it gradually erodes the authority that these organizations use to keep themselves in power, as a result creating space that others can enter into to seize power with an alternate vision. Now, in relation to your question on geopolitics of Mexico, actually, most Mexicans know more about this than I do. But I'll just give you my perspective, because I don't think it's going to continue at all, but simply it may be interesting to see what my naive perspective is. Well, of course, you're right. Mexico's relationship is different compared to countries in South America. It's smack up against the border of the only remaining superpower in the world, has extensive trade as a result of NAFTA, but also all sorts of other integration agreements, increasingly extensive cultural exchange and movement of people in the two countries. So that Canadianization of Mexico is something that Mexico has to deal with, and it's not easy. I've spoken to Mexican diplomats about this problem, and they understand dealing with this big beast on the northern border is the number one element of foreign policy, and it constrains how Mexico operates and what it can do. On the other hand, Mexico does have a special ability to affect the United States. And if you look at the number of Spanish speakers now in the United States, the number of Mexicans in the United States in one way or another, it does have a special ability. As the largest Spanish language speaker, Mexico also has a type of leadership position with Spanish Latin America that I think is really very important. So that harmony between Spanish speaking, the spread of Spanish ideas to Mexico from Latin America is something I think is very healthy for Mexico. Mexico also has a responsibility to not dilute out the good ideas that are occurring in Latin America with its numerical presence in Spanish. We have lost the fight against censorship as an aberration. That's absolutely clear to me. Censorship is now the norm. It is not the exception. Why is that? Well, because when everyone can publish, so much gets published that is annoying to so many people from so many different angles. And there are so many publishers who can't stand up to pressure that censorship becomes the norm. And it is the norm if you look at Facebook creating new sorts of laws emanating out of its company and the United States, which it then starts applying to everyone. It's censoring all sorts of stuff. Similarly, the other large American organizations are doing this, but it's everywhere. I mean, I was in a chat on Reddit about this Google book, and someone asked some question about Gamergate, which was then immediatly censored right in front of a question about censorship of Reddit, which was then itself censored right in front of my eyes. So it's everywhere now, and the speed at which information is being produced means that exceptional behavior is no longer meaningful. It's only when it involves the collapse of some great powerful group that it becomes important. But that something has happened at all is no longer meaningful because there's so much information flooding around. So I see all sorts of newspapers and news organizations censoring all the time, not even trying to make some excuse for it. And then they're found out and it just goes away in the wash because there's so much information going on. So censorship is the new normal. Let's look at the other end of the question. Is it possible to publish somewhere to almost everyone something that you want to publish in a way that has an impact? At the moment, we're still able to do that. There's a lot of push, there's a lot of momentum to try and stop that. And it is getting increasingly hard. We're still able to do it, but that's our specialty business. Most other people find it hard to do now. And the lack of anonymity also makes it harder because the consequences, you think, well, I can publish in a different jurisdiction. The jurisdictions are all getting connected together. The International Intelligence Agency cooperation, law enforcement cooperation means that just publishing a different jurisdiction isn't going to save you. The different jurisdiction will probably rat you out. And the lack of anonymity means you'll be traced back. So it is increasingly hard. On the other hand, the internet makes a global market. And so you only actually need a couple of niche players in the business of publishing the hardest content to publish. And we're in that business for a lot of that type of material, not all, but a lot of it. But maybe it's possible that we'll be able to preserve the ability to publish. The internet has become largely a fixed target. States are slow to move and big organizations are slow to move. With the internet now, its basic architecture has been the same since 1994. Web addresses, IP addresses, domain names, etc. As a result, the state mechanisms have started to adapt to it and work out how to throttle it. On the other hand, you have new protocols coming up, overlaying onto the top of it. So all these smartphone apps, for example, which are exploding everywhere. It's a new protocol. And states are then going to have to work out how to adapt to these new protocols and bring their censorship mechanisms inside these new protocols. And the pace of technological innovation, if it keeps going and keeps diversifying, keeps creating these layers upon layers, may be able to outrun the attempts to censor it. Thank you, Mexico.